Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network, so join Mary, Shirley, and Lisa Fine as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Welcome to the Great Women in Compliance podcast with Lisa Fine and Mary Shirley. I'm Mary Shirley, and today we've got a guest for you, Kris Robidoux. Welcome, Kris. Tell us about your background.
Well, hi, Mary, and thanks so much for having me on this podcast. I've been an avid subscriber for a while. I came about compliance in a way that I think is very similar to many compliance officers that you know, and that is by accident. I was a criminal lawyer for 7 years. I graduated first with a Bachelor of Arts in Women's Studies and then went on to law school. And I moved to Calgary, Alberta, Canada in 1991, where I started as a criminal defense lawyer. I got a very unorthodox opportunity to switch completely mid-flight into a corporate role in 1998. So that is when I made the jump to a general counsel position with a propane gas company. Through that role, and as well a subsequent role as a compliance officer for a utility, I discovered that I really loved ethics and compliance as a way of avoiding criminal defense work. And so I really started to focus on it. And when my kids were very little, I thought that it would be a great part-time gig to do only transnational compliance as in a consulting role. So I started up my consulting company called Compliance-Works. Mm-hmm. And as you might expect, it was not part-time, and I do not do part-time very well. It went from 0 to 100. It took off like a rocket. It clearly filled a need that I don't think anyone really knew even existed yet, because nobody in Canada at that time was really talking about corporate compliance. So I operated Compliance-Works for 4 years. It was the opposite of part-time. And finally, it was my husband that suggested that really, if I was going to do this ethics and compliance thing in a big way and large-scale investigations and large-scale compliance programs for these very hungry Canadian multinational companies, he suggested you might need the infrastructure of a law firm. And so I did that. I moved that practice to what is now an international law firm and did that for 9 years. And just 2 years ago now, I've come back, seemingly full circle, into an in-house compliance officer role with an oil and gas company operating here in Calgary with all of our oil operations in South America. So that's the real circuitous, unorthodox route that I've taken to get here.
And definitely not part-time.
Never part-time. I want part-time.
Kris, you have the very prestigious title and accolade of being a Queen's Counsel. And in New Zealand, a Queen's Counsel designation is only bestowed on our very best and brightest lawyers. Tell us about your achievements that led to this honour.
As we just discussed, there really was no one working to advance the role of compliance and ethics in corporations at that time, at the time of my appointment, which was January 1st, 2008. So that was seen at the time as, I think, a real contribution to the legal profession here in Alberta, which tends to be what the government recognizes when making those appointments. Recipients have to have been called to the bar for at least 10 years. The title recognizes some outstanding contribution to the profession or to public life. So for me, it was primarily the work that I had done to advance this role and this profession. It's interesting because the award's been criticized in Canada in the past on the basis that the appointment was viewed as depending largely on political affiliations, etc., and suggestions that perhaps the whole tie to the monarchy and was not consistent with modern Canadian identities. But in the provinces of Canada where we continue to appoint lawyers as Queen's Counsel, there have been reforms that have been made to depoliticize the award. So we're screened by committees that are composed of representatives from the bench and the bar and the law society and the various bar associations. And that is how those recognitions are made. And one more interesting tidbit is that, as you pointed out, the title is Queen's Counsel. The full title is Her Majesty's Counsel Learned in the Law. And but of course, during the reign of a king, that title will change to King's Counsel or KC. So it'll be interesting because in my lifetime, we assume that Queen Elizabeth II will be succeeded by Prince Charles or Prince William, and that will mean that my title will then change to Casey.
Oh, that is cool. And they never taught us the full-length title at law school in New Zealand, so I learned something today. Thank you. At Great Women in Compliance, we love and laud trailblazers, and you are someone who has really led the way for anti-corruption in Canada, which we've just touched on. So why don't we elaborate a little bit more on that? Tell us about your role in the first two anti-corruption cases, and how did they shape the future of compliance for your country?
Well, that is very kind of you to call me a trailblazer, but I mean, it is at least partly or largely due to luck and timing. Given the route that I've already shared with you about how I came into compliance, I saw at the time in the late 90s and early 2000s, what was happening in the United States as far as enforcement of these laws and transnational laws. And we know in Canada that what we see happening in the United States as far as regulation and enforcement eventually tends to trickle north to Canada. And that was in a time when the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was really starting to see a boom in enforcement. And so, not so much maybe a trailblazer as, just a surfer that happens to see the right wave that is coming and positions herself, for that wave. And so in 2009, when I was a partner in a national law firm in Canada, our client, NICO Resources, was the first Canadian company to find itself in the crosshairs of Canadian enforcement officials for anti-bribery violations alleged to have occurred overseas under Canada's version of the FCPA, the Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act, the CFPOA. And we were defense counsel for NICO, and that case resulted in a guilty plea and a conviction and a very large fine for that company. Then, of course, that positioned us well to assist the next Canadian company in 2011, Griffiths Energy International. That was a company, a Canadian private oil and gas company that was doing business in Chad, in Africa. And it was the case that was the very first voluntary self-disclosure of corrupt activity under the CFPOA. And that really was the case that I think companies on fire a little bit here in Canada and got everybody to take notice. It was a case where payments had been made to a third party that were destined for a public official. There was no regime or framework in place for a company to do a voluntary self-disclosure, but given the circumstances of the company, it was required and it was appropriate. And so we had to manage that with first the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who is the investigative authority, and then with the Department of Public Prosecutions, the enforcement and prosecuting agency after that, without there being any roadmap, no guidance. We had at that time no legislation or framework to govern these self-disclosures, and there was no way to negotiate a deferred prosecution or a non-prosecution agreement. Those simply did not exist. So we had to kind of go in blindly, and the authorities had to trust us, and we had to trust them. And the result was also, again, like in NICO, the result was a guilty plea. But I do recommend the sentencing decision in that case, which you can find by Googling, or if you or your listeners get in touch with me, I can send a link to the decision. But Justice Scott Brooker went on for 4 pages in the transcript discussing what that company did to identify and remediate the violations. Mm-hmm. And it really does serve as a really good roadmap for companies. So that was really really our role in those 2 cases. And I think the way they will shape the future of compliance is that it demonstrates that our enforcement authorities are perhaps not yet at a level of the DOJ in the United States or the SFO in the UK or other agencies, but they are getting better. They are working effectively with their international counterparts. And there's now a bit of a precedent that's been set by our courts for what is going to be expected for companies who are seeking leniency in sentencing and are seeking to avoid probation or monitors. And that really is the Brooker guidance that I described earlier.
Fantastic. And you know what, Kris, I think you're being a little bit too humble and not giving yourself enough credit. If it was so easy to determine that this was going to be the next big thing, wouldn't all other lawyers have turned their minds to it? But I think it takes a special person to be prescient enough and also get the timing right. If you'd moved in too early, your business would not have been a success whatsoever. If you'd left it too late, you wouldn't have been able to grab the opportunities that you did. So I will continue to think of you as a trailblazing model, even if you're not quite there with me.
Thank you, Mary.
And, one of the things about being prescient is that quite often it's the case that whatever happens in one country could be the start of almost like a forest fire for the rest of the world. And Canada is in the relatively unique position. And I don't mean to disparage you in any way. My country's kind of the last to ever come to do almost anything. So, you guys are kind of shadowed or overshadowed by the United States in many ways. And so you're in a slightly unique position, I think, in that when it has come to the legalization of cannabis in Canada, you guys are kind of at the forefront, and the United States has an opportunity to learn from you. So I'd like to ask you, what is your top consideration for in-house professionals who may shortly have to deal with employees and lawful cannabis consumption in the United States and, of course, other jurisdictions? Because, of course, New Zealand is probably watching eagerly and hoping to jump on board as well. What other jurisdictions far and wide, what advice would you have?
That is a great question. And I'm not entirely sure that Canada can be that much help on the issues relating to the legalization of cannabis, because it really still is so new here. And Canada is dealing with a lot of the wrinkles that early implementation of these laws and these rules have brought about. So I hope you will ask me that question in another year. But I would say that at least we here in Canada already have a very strong framework for human rights and the protection of privacy, data protection, etc. Those protections, I think, work to help us ensure a very rigorous framework for testing in an employment context for impairment by cannabis. And it's something that's very near and dear to my heart because, of course, I work in a safety-sensitive industry, that being oil and gas. And so, I think that the most important lesson that we have learned is that you need to address issues of impairment, presence of cannabis in the system, and ability to perform a job function. You need to address what is your position going to be on that early and consistently. So, will you test for impairment pre-hire, pre-site access? Will you seek to perform random testing for the presence of alcohol or drug in an employee system? Or how about simply post-incident? All of these are questions that you can't really decide on the fly. You need to think about it ahead of time. So, whether we're doing it right or wrong, I think remains to be seen. But I think that will be, one of the top considerations for in-house professionals when cannabis is ultimately legalized across the board in the United States, which my personal view is I anticipate that will occur.
I think that's probably right. And I'm thinking as well for New Zealand, we will potentially follow a similar route. And I wouldn't be surprised if several other countries do as well. And I'm sure that several will hold off from legalization in the short to medium term at least. I think a related question that I would be considering would be whether you're going to choose to treat cannabis exactly the same as you do alcohol in terms of your workplace policies, or will you categorize it differently and have different standards and rules for it?
Well, exactly, because then what it does is it forces an organization to consider issues of social hosting, social consumption. I may not be allowed to consume alcohol, in my office or on my company's premises, but am I entitled to have a beer at lunch? Mm-hmm. That is something that has been in the past, perhaps, more socially acceptable. Mm-hmm. Will it be the same with cannabis? And, I think the experts are all still weighing in on some of those issues. How do you quantify the amount of cannabis, the amount of intoxication due to cannabis use? All of these, I think it's a very dynamic issue. Mm-hmm. It continues to evolve, and I think that smart compliance professionals are going to keep their ear to the ground and their eye on the road, and be very careful to watch other jurisdictions as they work their way through some of these issues.
Shared with us your life cycle of being in various positions, consultancy, law firm, and now in-house. What was your biggest lesson learned transitioning from a compliance and investigations practice in a global firm to a compliance role in a corporation?
The greatest lesson I believe I've learned is that I needed to have far greater respect for the job, the very difficult job that in-house compliance professionals are called upon to do every day. Mm-hmm. I had forgotten, to be honest. I mean, I was last in-house in 1998 and in 2000 to 2004, and I had forgotten about the difference in converting legal advice to action in those two very different environments. As an outside legal professional, I didn't have to get buy-in from executives. I didn't have to use scarce resources to operationalize my advice. Mm-hmm. It was quite a bit easier, I believe, when I was outside counsel. I would study an issue, give advice, tell folks what to do, then leave, then send a big bill.
Yeah.
But now I give the advice. I have to tell them what we have to do, and now I'm the one that's expected to do it. And I think that that's a good and important lesson that I've maybe not learned, but I've been reminded of.
And I suppose when you next go into private practice, I'm hoping you'll remember that, because I know that you're very ambitious and you're a lady who keeps moving. So I'm sure that there are still many more chapters in store for you in your career. So it's great to have that little reminder at front of mind should you choose to go back into private practice.
Oh, don't hold your breath, Mary.
Whatever it is, I know it's going to be long hours and hard work. One of your key strengths is in investigations, and in fact, you've previously been named one of the top 100 women in investigations by Global Investigations Review. I note additionally that in 2013, you were named one of Canada's top 25 most influential lawyers by Canadian Lawyer magazine, and kudos to you for those well-deserved accolades. I think one of the trickiest areas of investigations is when you may have someone who is claiming retaliation for raising a compliance concern, but the reality is that separately, this individual has been a performance management concern for some time. And of course, we know that best compliance practice is to document well when managers first start performance managing someone in order to have a paper trail that there are bona fide performance concerns. What else should companies do in this situation, particularly when they have in mind terminating the individual for poor performance, but the legal department might be skittish about the retaliation issue?
Well, you're right that is a very thorny aspect to investigations. I have a view about whistleblowers that has often caused my clients or my executive team to look at me like I have three heads. Mm-hmm. Because I say whistleblowers must always be, seen as a gift. Mm-hmm. And so, there is perhaps a supposition that they have an axe to grind or a bone to pick. But I think you treat whistleblowers with respect. And, right from the outset, you don't shoot the messenger. They are bringing you information that could be critically important to the ongoing viability of your company, really, mm-hmm. at its roots. So, but that said, you can't let the fact that they're a whistleblower dissuade you from taking legitimate action for mm-hmm. a legitimate performance issue. Mm-hmm. To say that a company can never discipline an employee for a bona fide performance issue just because they once engaged in a protected activity makes no sense to me. But I would say that the burden of proof is of course going to be much higher in those cases. So mm-hmm. I think the main question that employers have to ask is, why are you disciplining now? So if an employee is guilty of insubordination or an attendance violation or worse, but if that bad behavior has been going on for months or even years and the employer has done nothing until after that employee engaged in the protected mm-hmm. activity, well then it makes sense that discipline is going to likely be seen as retaliation. Mm-hmm. And that same result can also occur if the protected employee is singled out for discipline for what others may have been getting away with all this time. So, so what's an employer to do, really? Unfortunately, what I've seen is that very frequently, an employer that is fearing a retaliation claim will just do nothing and treat that employee as untouchable. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that needs to be the case. Right. I think we recognize that the situation is delicate, but you don't give them a lifelong pass. I think the first issue that you face is, okay, would this discipline be consistent with the way other employees involved in the same or similar conduct were treated? So if the answer is no, that you're not treating similar violators with similar consequences, then you can't take action without first changing that past practice. Notify employees in writing that there's a new way of dealing with these kinds of allegations. There's new discipline guidelines, and then acting consistently going forward and not relying on the past behavior. But assuming you can answer that first question in the affirmative, that is that others have been disciplined for the same kind of behavior, then you address the next most important question, And that is, why are you disciplining this person now? So how long after the employee engaged in the protected activity do you have to wait before we can discipline him or her? And I think if that question has any kind of a gray answer to it, then I think it's wise to maybe give a written warning versus proceeding with more serious discipline, or at the very least, consulting with counsel to work through some of those gray areas. It's like you said, Mary. The documentation becomes essential, and I think it's never too late to start documenting problems. Mm-hmm. So that process might require additional time, and might require that you give that employee additional chances to correct his or her behavior before disciplinary action is taken. But building sufficient evidence to discipline a protected employee is preferable to either treating him or her as untouchable or losing a retaliation lawsuit.
Agree. And I think similarly, I would also say it's never too early to document. I think there is a lot of fear in people to have the challenging conversation with a colleague that on a personal level, they may very much like and respect and feel like they don't want to make things too official too soon. However, I think that can cause problems further down the track if the performance management hasn't gone as planned and there's nothing to indicate that there were concerns with this employee because the paper trail doesn't show it. But there has been a concern, just more unspoken, I guess, if you could put it that way, in terms of being unofficially discussed, and then it becomes too late. So as Tom Fox always says, document.
I agree with him and you entirely.
Thank you. Sometimes there can be a lack of understanding among employees as well as management teams about the role of compliance and how some of their actions, even if meant to be humorous, can undermine us in compliance. What has been your experience of this, and how do you recommend best working through these challenges?
That the greatest misunderstanding among executive teams that I've worked with in the past is to characterize us as the police, which has a negative undertone of someone that is out there sniffing out infractions. They're looking for wrongdoing. They're pouncing on violations. I've even read recently on social media, police forces are taking to Twitter and LinkedIn to lament that some parents are still in this day and age trying to scare their kids into good behavior by saying that if they misbehave, we'll have to call the police. I mean, it sounds weird, I know, but I suppose those parents are trying to encourage good behaviors, but the effect is to create a sense that the police are bad, they're out to get you. And so those same kids, when they're in trouble or when they need help, they are much less likely to seek out the police. And I think the same thing goes for compliance officers.
Right.
I was a compliance officer for a utility that in an industry that had recently been deregulated in Alberta. So there was a regulated side of the entity and an unregulated, and the two had very, very strict rules over how they could interact and the information that they could share, et cetera. And that was part of my role to enforce those rules as the compliance officer. And I remember once I was walking down the hall, and it was a very open concept office where all the desks were out in the open, and the chief operating officer on the deregulated side, I'm sure meant to be humorous, but he would see me coming down the hall and he would make a big show about physically diving under a desk to hide from the compliance police. His employees thought it was hilarious, but it made things very difficult for me. He belittled the role, and he made it known that compliance was to be feared and avoided. We were the sales prevention department. I still think about those interactions on a regular basis. And I work very hard to make sure that I'm not seen in that way in my current role. I would take a much more positive view of, what is a compliance officer? It's someone who champions corporate integrity. It's, we enable the successful deployment of objectives. We are teachers. We are, we're guides for the company. At the risk of minimizing this and making a joke out of it. I don't really mean to make a joke out of it, but I actually think of compliance officers as, we're like the Google Maps. Well, I mean, just think about it. Mm-hmm. You tell me where you want to go, mm-hmm. and I can help you get there. You tell me, do you want the quickest route? Do you want the safest route? Do you want the route with the most gas stations along the way? You can zoom in, you can zoom out, but consult the Google Maps before you get on the road. And that's how I can be of maximum service to you to get you where you're trying to go. And so I do use that analogy from time to time. And again, they sometimes look at me like I have three heads, but other times they react the way you have, which is to agree.
Yeah, that is the best analogy I've heard. I mean, I think several of us have heard of sort of the lighthouse, that guiding light, but I think that preciseness about Google Maps, and also I love that this analogy gives you the options, right? Like in compliance, we don't want to just be the people that say no, like you can't get in your car at all and block off the road in front. We want to say, well, how is it that you want to get there? And what is it that you need along the way? And we will help you with that. So I'm really thrilled with that, Kris. And it just reminds me how much I really admire you for being such a strong thought leader, because that is a great metaphor that I'm sure I'll use going forward.
By all means, let's start a Google Maps discussion one day.
Fabulous. And armed with the benefit of hindsight, what key piece of advice would you give to new graduate Kris about to embark on her career?
I just celebrated the 28th anniversary of this very predetermined idea of what the road was going to look like and what my career was going to look like. But when I today think back on all of my zigs and zags, I mean, I realized that those 180-degree, hairpin career turns that I've taken were what have given me the greatest satisfaction over my career. The reinvention of oneself and one's career is tremendously gratifying. I think that it has kept me learning and growing, developing, and I think it keeps a person young. So I think what I would tell my young self is, do not ever be afraid of taking a bit of a leap and doing something completely different, or taking a risk on a burgeoning industry or profession that's not fully built out yet. You can be part of, the infrastructure that builds it out. You can be part of something that's groundbreaking and cool if you do take those risks. So I think that's the advice that I would give to myself or any young compliance professional just coming into the profession.
That's great. Thank you, Kris. The Women in the Workplace report released in 2018 by McKinsey & Company and leanin.org found that 64% of women experience microaggressions in the office, which include being mistaken for being more junior and having their capability questioned. When women are exposed to such behaviour, they are 3 times more likely to think about quitting on a regular basis. Christine Porras has studied incivility in the workplace and found that even witnessing incivility at work can make people 3 times less likely to help others. So what part can you play in reducing microaggressions and the effect of them in the workplace? Be conscious of your own words and whether they could be reframed in a way that might unintentionally or subconsciously belittle others. If you see someone else on the business end of a microaggression, help to gently draw it to the attention of the offending person by saying, "It was probably not your intent," and explain how the comment could have been perceived or interpreted in a less than kind way. If you don't feel confident enough to do that, brighten up the day of the person experiencing the microaggression and compliment them on recent work product that you have admired to help remind them of the positive effects they have at work. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you, Kris, for being a wonderful guest, and thank you for listening.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.